Chapter 1. A Celebration and a Shock. The summer sun had chosen to shine with uncommon generosity upon the village of Lower Melford that Saturday, casting long golden beams over its cobbled lanes, tidy rose gardens, and stone-fronted cottages. On the southern edge of the village green stood the Swan's Head Inn, its crooked windows and climbing ivy giving it the look of a place too old and dignified for anything so crass as scandal. But today, scandal, or something very near it, had come knocking. Inside the inn's courtyard, bunting flapped cheerfully in the breeze, and long trestle tables overflowed with cucumber sandwiches, buttered scones, and 3 varieties of Victoria sponge. It was the Swan's Head Centennial Celebration, hosted by its proud proprietor, Mr. Felix Withers, a man who wore waistcoats with tiny silver swans on the buttons and insisted the inn's ale was the only honest pint left in England. Nearly everyone in the village was in attendance. The vicar's wife was seen instructing the young maid from the bakery on the correct way to brew Ceylon tea. Mrs. Vinton, the colonel's widow, was already 2 glasses into the sherry, and Mr. Archibald Lanes, the solicitor, was making elaborate boasts about his trout fishing expedition to anyone who would listen. The only one not partaking in the boisterous cheer was Miss Jane Marple. She was seated on a cane-backed chair near a hedge of lavender, knitting calmly, a faint smile on her lips. Her needles clicked softly, but her eyes, sharper than they appeared, behind her dainty spectacles, missed little. She watched the way young Daphne Withers, Felix's daughter, kept glancing toward the upper window of the inn's east wing. She noted how Major Greeley scowled into his glass whenever Mr. Lane spoke, and she observed with quiet curiosity that despite the celebration being in his honor, Felix Withers looked distinctly distracted. At precisely 4:30, just as the string quartet struck up a fragile rendition of Greensleeves, a shriek rang out from the direction of the east wing. It came from Daphne. She had gone inside only moments before, a tray of lemonade in her hands and a tremor in her step. Now she stumbled out of the side door into the courtyard, white as the linen on the tables and trembling so badly she nearly dropped the tray. "Father! Someone's." Felix was at her side in an instant. So was the vicar. And then, as if the entire village had rehearsed it, they surged toward the inn's east wing like spectators to a theater fire. Miss Marple set down her knitting, rose without haste, and followed them in. Upstairs at the far end of a narrow hall that smelt faintly of beeswax and pipe smoke, the door to room 6 stood open. Inside, a man lay sprawled on the floor. His head was turned at an unnatural angle, one arm flung out as if in protest. There was a spreading stain beneath him, dark and final. Felix Withers stopped dead. "Dear God," he whispered. "That's Mr. Blaine. Albert Blaine." Mr. Blaine had checked into the inn only 2 days prior, claiming to be a writer seeking quiet. In truth, few had believed him. He had a briefcase with a combination lock, a waxed mustache that didn't suit his unassuming clothes, and a habit of lowering his voice whenever asked about his work. "Call the police," someone murmured. "No," Felix snapped. "Call Dr. Edgecombe. First things first." "But he's clearly dead," cried Mrs. Vinton. Miss Marple, who had drifted to the edge of the crowd, peered gently at the body. She made no dramatic pronouncements, only studied the scene quietly. The window was open, but no ladder lay beneath. The rug was rumpled oddly, and the ink blotter on the desk bore a single name pressed deep into the paper. Rex. She turned to look at the faces around her. Daphne, pale and shaking. Felix, his jaw clenched but eyes darting. The vicar frowning with genuine bewilderment. The others, all stunned into a charged silence. She had seen such silences before. In drawing rooms where scandal hovered, in tea shops where gossip paused for confirmation. It was not just the silence of shock. It was the silence of calculation, of those who knew something was wrong long before the body was found. "Strangled?" asked Major Greeley grimly, looking at Dr. Edgecombe, who had now arrived. "Possibly. Certainly not a fall or illness. I'll know more shortly." "Why on earth would anyone murder a man at the Swan's Head?" someone muttered. Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the ink blotter again. She knew better than to answer such questions. Too soon. Instead, she folded her hands and murmured, "Human nature, I expect. It's always the most underestimated motive of all." And quietly, almost unnoticed, she slipped back downstairs to resume her knitting, though her needles did not move, and her thoughts were anything but idle. Chapter 2. Whispers and Wonderings by. The following morning, the shock had settled over Lower Melford like a fine mist, clinging to every doorway, hedge, and conversation. Though the bunting still fluttered above the Swan's Head Inn, it now seemed absurdly festive, like a smile at a funeral. The celebration had, of course, been abandoned. The tables had been cleared, the musicians paid early and sent away, and the once cheerful garden now stood empty save for a few overturned chairs and a forgotten plate of ham rolls. Inside the inn, the parlor had been commandeered by the local constable, a slow-moving man named Inspector Crail, who had once worked in Eastbourne and liked to quote his time there, as if it gave him the insight of Scotland Yard. He was interviewing the staff, and guests one by one, his notebook dog-eared and his pen leaking slightly onto his fingers. Felix Withers, who had offered Inspector Crail the use of his study, paced in small, agitated circles outside the door, chain-smoking and muttering to himself. Miss Marple, having already given her statement, brief and delicately phrased, had taken up a quiet position in the corner of the parlor with her knitting once more. She was not the sort to push her way forward, but as was often the case, no one thought to ask her to leave. And so she remained, her needles clinking softly, her ears attuned to every breath and hesitation. From what she had gathered thus far, Mr. Albert Blaine had no local connections. He had arrived 2 nights ago with a single suitcase, paid in advance for a week's stay, and kept largely to himself. He had taken his meals in the garden when weather allowed, spoken little beyond polite greetings, and had requested his room not be cleaned until his departure. "That in itself is rather odd," murmured Miss Marple aloud, as she pearl-stitched, though she addressed no one in particular. "People who wish for privacy often wish for secrecy, too." Meanwhile, the villagers were in their usual fine form, gossiping with the fervor of people whose lives rarely brushed against anything more criminal than the odd parking violation at the market. At the grocer's, Mrs. Dillingham insisted to all within earshot that Blaine had been a confidence man, or perhaps a foreign spy. "Those mustaches, you know, waxed, like something from a picture show." At the bakery, young Sarah Trim recounted with the flair of a stage actress how she had once seen Mr. Blaine post a letter with no return address. "He looked right at me afterward, and I swear it gave me a chill." And in the churchyard, Major Greeley, pipe clenched in teeth, declared that Blaine had been just the sort to end up strangled. Shifty eyes, thin lips. Never trust a man with thin lips. But it was in the drawing room of the Swan's Head that the most intriguing conversation took place, between Miss Marple and Daphne Withers. Daphne had asked to sit with Miss Marple, ostensibly for comfort, though her hands twisted in her lap, with something closer to guilt. "I just can't believe it," she murmured. "I only went to bring him lemonade. I didn't expect—" Her voice trailed off. "You poor dear," said Miss Marple gently, setting her knitting in her lap. "It must have been dreadful for you." Daphne nodded mutely. Her eyes were rimmed with sleeplessness. "I didn't even know he was staying with us until Father mentioned it Friday evening. Said Mr. Blaine was a literary gentleman and liked to keep to himself. I brought him a new towel that night. He barely looked at me." "Did he seem frightened?" asked Miss Marple softly. "Uneasy, perhaps. I wouldn't say frightened." Daphne hesitated. "But he seemed watchful, as if he expected something, or someone." Miss Marple gave a slight nod. "People rarely retreat to country inns without purpose, Miss Daphne. Writers, of course, may seek peace and quiet, but so may men hoping not to be found." Daphne looked down. Do you think it was a robbery? We've had no other guests since Thursday. The rooms on that floor were empty." "A curious thief who takes nothing but a life," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. "Unless the thing they came to take was something immaterial. Silence. A secret, perhaps." Daphne's brows drew together. That's rather poetic, Miss Marple. Death is often poetic, my dear, and rather more common than people like to admit. Before Daphne could reply, Inspector Crail re-emerged into the hall, his expression pained. He glanced at Miss Marple, gave a grunt of uncertain acknowledgement, and then turned to Daphne. I'll need to speak with you shortly, Miss Withers. Just routine. He tapped his notebook with a finger. There's a gentleman on his way from the county, Detective Inspector Galloway. Been sent down from Exeter. Seems Mr. Blaine wasn't quite the anonymous guest we thought. Felix Withers, who had reappeared with another cigarette trembling between his fingers, stiffened. What do you mean? Crail looked at him with narrowed eyes. Apparently, Mr. Blaine was under investigation. Fraud, they think. Something to do with forged land deeds and a shell company in Reading. Galloway's bringing more details. Felix turned pale. Good Lord. Miss Marple, ever gentle, rose to her feet. Then I imagine the nature of Mr. Blaine's visit was not as simple as a writing retreat. More like hiding in plain sight, muttered Crail. But not hiding well enough, murmured Miss Marple. Her eyes flicked to Daphne again, then briefly to Felix, whose face had not recovered its color. Outside, a soft summer rain had begun to fall, tapping against the windows of the Swan's Head Inn. The village would talk, of little else for days to come. But for Miss Marple, the real question remained suspended quietly in the back of her mind. Who in Lower Melford had known the truth about Mr. Blaine before his body was ever found? And more importantly, who had wanted it buried with him? Chapter 3. The village begins to buzz by. Monday morning, Lower Melford was alive with the kind of fervor only murder could inspire. The women of the village, fortified with oversteeped tea and a righteous sense of curiosity, had each become experts in crime, and no corner of the high street was without whispered theories, knowing glances, and solemn headshakes. Mrs. Trowbridge, of the post office, declared confidently that it had been a crime of passion. Mark my words, she told Mr. Haspel, the butcher, as she passed him in the lane. These solitary types always get tangled in something messy. Probably some lover come to confront him, Mr. Haspel grunted, or someone he owed money to. You ask me, that man didn't look solvent. But it was in the parlor of the vicarage, over her third cup of Darjeeling, that Mrs. Calthorpe made the pronouncement that rippled outward like a pebble in a pond. I should think it's obvious, she said, pursing her lips. Felix Withers knew him. The vicar coughed gently. Now, Edna, let's not jump to conclusions. Oh, Henry, don't be soft. They recognized each other. I'm certain of it. Did you see Felix's face when the body was found? Shocked. Yes, but also unsettled, as if a past had returned. Miss Marple, who was also present but as usual keeping a low profile near the bookshelf, did not interject. She simply filed the observation away with the others, like Daphne's trembling hands or Inspector Crail's failure to ask the right questions. She had learned long ago that people's assumptions often revealed more than their facts. Later, that day, as the drizzle turned to a soft gray fog, Miss Marple visited the Swan's Head again under the pretext of returning a borrowed umbrella. Felix Withers met her at the door, his face worn from sleeplessness. Miss Marple, he said wearily, I didn't expect visitors. Oh, I do apologize, she said kindly, but I thought I ought to return this while I remembered. Your umbrella is quite distinct, ivory handle with the swan's head carving. Most elegant. Felix accepted it absently. Yes, thank you. You look quite pale, Miss Marple said gently. These things are never easy. And you had such high hopes for your celebration. Felix gave a hollow laugh. 100 years of history, and now this will be what people remember. Still, said Miss Marple, studying him, I imagine it is not the first time someone's past has complicated your work here. Inns do collect stories. That earned a brief flicker of something in his eyes. Caution, perhaps. I'm not sure what you mean. Oh, nothing at all, she said. Merely that I imagine you see all types, fugitives, lovers in secret, meetings, those with things to hide. My nephew Raymond once stayed at an inn in Cornwall where it turned out a guest was hiding from a tax inquiry. simply dreadful. Felix forced a smile, but Miss Marple had already seen the tension in his jaw. Was Mr. Blaine the only guest that night? She asked lightly. Only one checked in. There was a reservation for a Mrs. Horton from Cheltenham, but she never arrived. How disappointing. Did she telephone to cancel? No, Felix admitted. She simply didn't come. I suppose I ought to follow up. I do wonder, Miss Marple mused, if that was a real reservation at all. Felix's brow furrowed. What are you suggesting? Only that it's a clever trick, isn't it? Book a room under another name to make it appear as though someone else was nearby. It creates just the right amount of ambiguity. Of course, it's only a theory. He looked at her for a long moment. You've a sharp mind, Miss Marple. Not sharp, she corrected him. Only observant. With that, she took her leave, walking back toward the center of the village as the fog clung to her cardigan. She passed the bakery, where Sarah, Trim and her brother Toby were whispering behind the counter. She says she saw someone climbing the garden wall that night, Sarah whispered loudly enough for Miss Marple to hear. Around 11. Said she thought it was a fox until it stood up straight. Who? Toby asked. Ellen Ray, the gardener's daughter. But don't repeat it. She said she was out to meet her young man. Miss Marple did not pause. She simply let the remark sit where it fell, like a seed in fertile soil. She would speak to Ellen Ray in her own time. That evening, as she sat by her fireplace knitting a new pair of mittens for her niece, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the blotter again. The name, Rex, pressed so firmly into the paper. Not Mr. Blaine's name, and certainly not a guest at the inn. It must have meant something. The police, of course, had taken the blotter as part of the evidence, but Miss Marple had taken care to make a small note of the detail before they arrived. The name had been written with such force it almost tore the paper. Emotionally charged writing, she thought. Possibly anger. Possibly fear. She was interrupted by a knock at the door. Opening it, she found Daphne Withers pale but determined. I hope I'm not intruding, Daphne said quickly. I needed to talk to someone, and you always seem to understand people better than anyone else. Miss Marple gave a small, warm smile. Do come in, dear. The kettle's just boiled. As she ushered Daphne into the sitting room, she thought once more of the name Rex and of Felix's hollow eyes. Who was Rex? And what had he done to earn a place in Albert Blaine's final moments? Chapter 4. Tea with a Hint of Truth. Miss Marple's sitting room, with its lace curtains and faint scent of lavender polish, had a soothing effect on Daphne Withers. She sat on the edge of the floral armchair, her gloves still on, twisting them nervously while her eyes flitted around the room. Miss Marple, ever the hostess, poured 2 cups of tea, added a generous slice of lemon to Daphne's, and offered her a plate of digestives. I shouldn't stay long, Daphne murmured. Father doesn't know I've come. Then it is good you've come to someone who will neither judge nor betray your confidence, said Miss Marple calmly, taking up her seat opposite. Daphne looked down into her cup. Everyone's talking. I suppose I knew they would. But it's different when you hear your own name in a whisper. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. Whispers are a cruel currency in a village. They always cost more than they're worth. There was a pause as the girl gathered herself. Her voice, when it emerged, was quieter. I knew Mr. Blaine wasn't who he said he was. Miss Marple, though unsurprised, said nothing. Her silence, encouraging yet non-intrusive, always seemed to yield the truth sooner or later. He called himself Albert Blaine, Daphne went on. But I heard him on the telephone the first night. He arrived. I was coming up the stairs after locking the back door. His door was open just a crack. He didn't see me. What did he say? He said, "Tell Rex I don't scare easily. If he wants to finish it, he can come here and do it himself." Interesting, said Miss Marple softly, stirring her tea with quiet precision. And you didn't mention this to anyone? Daphne shook her head quickly. I wasn't supposed to overhear. I wasn't sure what it meant. And then when he was found, I was afraid they'd think I was involved. Miss Marple regarded her gently. Fear and truth are poor bedfellows, my dear. But you've done the right thing now. Daphne bit her lip. Miss Marple, do you think my father knows more than he's saying? A pause. I think, said Miss Marple delicately, that your father is a man who once lived another life. Perhaps a life he does not care to have revisited, and it's possible that Mr. Blaine was part of that life. Daphne gave a quiet, shaky nod. Outside, a dog barked once, then fell silent. The late afternoon sun pressed through the windows in a slanting beam, lighting up the dust motes in the air. Who is Rex? Daphne asked. That, Miss Marple said, is the right question. One I believe our dear Inspector Crail has entirely neglected to ask, though no doubt he will think of it eventually. But surely if Mr. Blaine was using a false name, there must be a way to find out who he really was, Daphne said. His real identity. Someone must have known him. Oh, I suspect someone did, Miss Marple said. Possibly more than one someone. What concerns me is whether that person is still in the village. That same evening at the Swan's Head Inn, Felix Withers stood in the half-lit hallway outside room 6. The room had been locked since the morning after the murder, but something about it drew him, like a confession he hadn't made. He placed a hand on the doorknob, then let it fall. His other hand trembled slightly as he withdrew a handkerchief and wiped his brow. When he turned, he nearly collided with Inspector Crail. Evening, the inspector said flatly. Inspector, Felix replied, managing a smile. You look uneasy. Felix gestured vaguely toward the locked room. Hard not to feel uneasy. In a house where a man died violently, especially when he died only a few feet from your daughter's bedroom. Crail gave a short grunt. The county man, Galloway, he's due in tomorrow. Word is that Blaine, or whatever his name really, was used at least 3 identities in the past 2 years. All linked to minor property frauds. He was slippery but nothing violent on record. This feels personal. Isn't it always, with murder? Felix asked quietly. Crail gave him a sideways look. Sometimes it's just desperation. The 2 men stood in silence for a moment longer before the inspector moved on. Felix remained by the door a moment more, then returned to his study and closed the door behind him with an audible click. Meanwhile, in a cottage at the far edge of the village, Miss Marple was finishing a quiet supper of cold chicken and mustard, greens when her clock chimed 7. She stood, cleared her plate, and fetched her cardigan. A 15-minute walk later, she was knocking gently at the side door of the Ray cottage. Ellen Ray, the gardener's daughter, answered with a start. Miss Marple? Forgive the intrusion, Miss Marple said kindly, but I believe you may have seen something the night Mr. Blaine died. I hope you don't mind an old woman's curiosity. Ellen hesitated, then let her in. I didn't want to cause trouble, the girl began, and I don't want to get Martin in trouble either. Your young man? She nodded. He works nights at the garage in Brixham. I sometimes sneak out to see him. We meet by the garden wall behind the inn. That night, well, I saw someone before I reached the wall. Who? I don't know, Ellen said. He or she was wearing a long coat. Could have been a man, could have been a woman. They were climbing out from the rose bed under room 6. I crouched down, didn't want to be seen. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. They climbed out? Not in? Ellen nodded. Out, I swear. I only caught a glimpse as they dropped to the ground and walked off into the trees. I stayed low until they were gone. Miss Marple's thoughts turned rapidly. The rose bed had been directly beneath Blaine's window. A descent, not an ascent. Whoever it was had left the scene after the crime, not arrived at it. I do hope, she said gently, that you'll share this with the police. Or at the very least with Inspector Galloway when he arrives. I will, Ellen said. Do you think it was the killer? I think, said Miss Marple, rising, that we are very close to discovering what it was Mr. Blaine knew, and what someone else would rather he'd forgotten. She thanked the girl, stepped out into the evening air, and walked home beneath a sky veiled in the thinnest crescent moon. She passed the inn on her way, its windows glowing dimly behind lace curtains. One of them, she noticed, went dark just as she passed, and for the first time since the affair had begun, Miss Marple felt certain that someone inside the Swans, head in, was watching her in return. Chapter 5. An inspector and an implication. Detective Inspector Galloway arrived in Lower Melford with the air of a man who disliked wasting time and despised small villages in equal measure. He was tall and angular, with a graying mustache, a worn leather satchel, and a habit of clenching his jaw whenever someone rambled unnecessarily, which in Lower Melford happened often. His first stop was the Swan's Head Inn, where Felix Withers greeted him with stiff politeness and offered him a room which he declined. "I won't be sleeping here, Mr. Withers," Galloway said with an edge. "I prefer not to rest under roofs that house active crime scenes. If it's all the same to you, I've booked a room at the Vicarage Annex." Felix made no protest. Galloway requested access to room 6 and was led up by Inspector Crail, who hovered like a nervous junior clerk. "We've preserved it as best we could," Crail explained, unlocking the door. "Didn't want to risk disturbing anything." Galloway stepped inside, surveying the room in silence. The furnishings were modest: a single bed, a writing desk, a wardrobe, and the now infamous blotter with the name Rex still faintly visible on a page beneath. A sheet of glass. He walked to the desk and crouched slightly. "No fingerprints lifted, smudged beyond use," said Crail. "Gloved, most likely." Galloway straightened. How long had Mr. Blaine been here before he was killed? 2 days, paid in advance for a week. And the time of death? Somewhere between 11 and midnight, according to Dr. Edgecombe. Witnesses? Crail hesitated. Daphne Withers found the body. Poor girl was bringing him lemonade. She swears she hadn't seen him before, but Miss Marple, Jane Marple, suggested the victim may have used an alias. We've got reason to believe he was involved in land fraud. 3 aliases across 2 counties, always stayed at smaller inns, kept to himself. Galloway raised an eyebrow. Jane Marple, I've heard the name. She's observant. Said Galloway, non-committal. Any other guests at the inn that night? None. There was a no-show booking, a Mrs. Horton from Cheltenham, but she never arrived. Mrs. Horton? Galloway flipped open his notebook. That name doesn't match any of the aliases connected to Blaine, likely a decoy. He closed the notebook with a snap and looked out the window. I want to speak with everyone who was in the inn that night, staff, family, even the cook. And I want to speak to Miss Marple as soon as it's polite to call on a lady. That same morning, Miss Marple had been working steadily in her garden, snipping lavender heads and tying them into neat bundles when she saw Daphne hurrying up the path. The girl was flushed and breathless, a newspaper clutched in one hand. They've printed his real name, Daphne said without preamble. Mr. Blaine, it's in the Exeter Herald. His name was Lawrence Templeton. Miss Marple took the paper gently and unfolded it. There, in small print beneath a bold headline reading, "Murder at Village Inn linked to land fraud scandal," was the name. Lawrence Templeton, formerly of Cardiff and London. Wanted for questioning in several dubious investment schemes. Templeton, Miss Marple repeated softly. Yes, that sounds far more like a man who wouldn't scare easily. There's more, Daphne said. It says he was believed to be the whistleblower in a scheme that involved people in government offices, someone who turned evidence. But they didn't say who he turned it against. Miss Marple nodded. Because they don't know. And those who do are keeping quiet. Daphne sank into a chair. Do you think that's why he came here? To hide? No, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. I think he came here to confront someone, or to corner them. She folded the paper carefully and turned back toward the house. Daphne, dear, have you ever heard your father mention the name Rex? Daphne blinked. Rex? No, never. It's not exactly common, is it? No, said Miss Marple. Which is precisely why it's important. Thank you, dear. You've been most helpful. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple received a formal visit from Detective Inspector Galloway, who stood on her doorstep with the reluctant respect of a man unaccustomed to seeking wisdom from pensioners. "Miss Marple," he said with a nod. "Might I have a moment?" "Certainly," she said, ushering him in and gesturing toward the sitting room. "Would you prefer Darjeeling or Assam?" "Neither, thank you. Just conversation." "As you wish." They sat. Galloway wasted no time. "I've read your file," he said. "The vicarage poisoning, the Paddington lace strangler, the stolen brooch affair in Chipping Cray. All rather straightforward once one notices the human element," Miss Marple said modestly. Galloway leaned forward. "You've already guessed that Blaine, Templeton, was using this inn as a meeting place, or perhaps a trap." "I believe so," Miss Marple said. "And I believe he was targeting someone who knew him well. Someone who might have tried to bury the past, only to have it unearthed by Mr. Templeton's arrival. And you believe that someone is here in Lower Melford?" "I do," Galloway nodded slowly. "This name, Rex. We haven't linked it yet. Doesn't match anyone Templeton was known to associate with." "No, I imagine it wouldn't," Miss Marple said. "But I've found that people often hide their greatest secrets in the open. A nickname, a middle name, a business alias long since discarded. There's more than one way to wear a mask, Inspector." Galloway studied her for a moment longer, then stood. "If you hear anything," he said. "Anything at all, I'll be sure to tell you," she replied. "Though I rather expect that before long the truth will present itself." As Galloway left, Miss Marple returned to her chair by the fire, knitting in her lap. "So then, Lawrence Templeton, a man with many enemies, but only one had followed him to Lower Melford. Only one had stood beneath that window hidden in the rose bed. Only one had known exactly when the inn would be empty, and now Miss Marple was almost certain who that person was. But knowing, she reminded herself, was not the same as proving Chapter 6. A garden of secrets. It was late afternoon when Miss Marple walked once more through the shaded footpath that led behind the Swan's Head Inn. The path was lined with ferns and foxgloves, and though the murder had cast a long shadow over Lower Melford, nature remained stubbornly indifferent. The birds still sang, the breeze still rustled the branches, and the roses beneath Room 6 bloomed with careless beauty. Miss Marple paused by the rose bed, her eyes lingering on the earth. Though the gardener had attempted to smooth the soil, since the incident, she could still detect the signs: a faint depression in the loam, a crushed edge of lavender that did not belong in the usual path of boots. Someone had descended from the window, just as Ellen Ray had said, and fled this way. But who? She turned at the sound of footsteps behind her and found herself face to face with Felix Withers. "You do favor this corner of the garden," he said with a faint smile. "May I ask what draws you to it?" "Only a certain fondness for roses," Miss Marple replied lightly. "Though I do wonder whether they've heard more secrets than they care to repeat." Felix's smile faltered. "Secrets are plentiful in a village, Miss Marple. Most are harmless, some less so." "Indeed," she said, eyes fixed on him. "But secrets have a way of surfacing, especially when prompted." Felix looked suddenly tired. "I haven't been sleeping well." "No, I imagine you haven't." For a long moment the two stood silently, the garden unusually quiet around them. Then Miss Marple asked gently, "Mr. Withers, what does the name Rex mean to you?" His eyes did not betray panic, but they did go still. "I suppose you've read the blotter." "I observed it, yes. It means nothing to me," he said finally. "Truly," Miss Marple nodded. "Very well. I shall not press. I'm only curious. I do find that names, especially unusual ones, have a way of returning, like ghosts." She gave him a gentle smile and left him standing there, motionless beside the rose bushes. That evening over supper, Miss Marple received a visit from young Toby Trim, the baker's son. He was clutching a folded piece of paper and looked as though he had just committed a small crime. I thought you might want to see this, Miss Marple," he said in a rush. "I found it yesterday, in the waste bin outside the Swan's Head." She unfolded it carefully. It was a torn letter, crumpled once and then half burned, though the flames had clearly been doused early. In a bold hand, the following could be made out. Rex. You always said you were cleverer than the rest of us. Now Templeton's surfaced. If you don't act, he will. Don't pretend you don't remember that night in Cardiff. There was no signature. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she laid it down beside her teacup. Where exactly did you find this, Toby? In the dustbin behind the inn, near the garden shed. Does anyone else know you took it? He shook his head. I didn't tell Mom. She'd skin me. Then let's keep it our secret. You've done a very good thing. She gave him a jam biscuit for his trouble and waited until he was gone before reading the letter again. So, there it was. Not just a name, but a link. Cardiff. A shared past. And not just with Templeton, but with Rex, whoever he was. Someone who knew Templeton. Someone clever and, most importantly, someone being warned. The following morning brought a commotion to the village. Inspector Galloway was posted in the public house, interviewing various staff and tradesmen who had come into contact with Templeton. But it was Miss Marple who walked quietly to the local records office. She had been there only once before, when she'd helped the vicar trace a family lineage dispute involving a disputed christening in 1892. The clerk, Mr. Linley, was a thin man with hair that clung to his skull in disciplined lines and a fondness for procedural neatness. I was wondering, Miss Marple said pleasantly, if you could help me locate any business records linked to the Swan's Head Inn. 20 or 25 years ago. Around the time Felix Withers came to Lower Melford, Mr. Linley looked slightly suspicious but did not protest. Public record, I suppose, though most old files are barely sorted. It took some time, but finally, Miss Marple found it. A business license issued to Frederick R. Withers in 1916 for the purchase of the Swan's Head Inn from one Norman Pikes. Frederick R. Withers, she murmured. Now we're getting somewhere. She copied the note into her pocketbook and thanked Mr. Linley before heading to the churchyard for a quiet moment. There, on a bench beneath the yew trees, she sat and let the breeze speak for a while. Rex. Could it be so simple? Could the Rex Templeton referred to have been none other than Felix himself? A middle name, a boyhood nickname, something used only by those who knew him in another life. And Cardiff. Cardiff had surfaced again. The city where Templeton had once worked, and apparently, where something had happened. Something that tied them all together. That afternoon, Miss Marple arranged for a quiet word with Inspector Galloway behind the vestry. I believe I may have a suggestion, she said calmly. Galloway looked weary. You always do. I think it possible that Felix Withers is not quite the man he claims to be. Galloway folded his arms. Go on. He purchased the inn under the name Frederick R. Withers. Not Felix. And I have reason to believe he once lived or was involved in Cardiff. At the same time as Lawrence Templeton, the name Rex may well have been a moniker used in those days. Galloway was silent, absorbing this. Miss Marple continued, I think Templeton came here to confront him. Perhaps to demand silence or perhaps to threaten exposure. Whatever the case, I believe someone feared what Templeton might reveal. Galloway scratched his chin. You believe Withers killed him? I didn't say that, but I believe Templeton's presence frightened someone who was very sure the past had been buried. Galloway gave her a long look. Miss Marple, he said finally, if you ever decide to work for the Yard, let me know. We could use your kind. She smiled. Oh no, Inspector, I find my own drawing room much more comfortable, and murder regrettably comes to villages often enough. As she made her way home once more, her thoughts turned not only to Felix, but to Daphne. Because if the sins of the past had indeed returned, then it was not just the innkeeper who had something to lose. It was his daughter. Chapter 7. Footprints. In the past, the next morning dawned gray and damp, with a sullen drizzle clinging to the cobbled paths of Lower Melford. It was the sort of weather that muted the world, perfect for reflection, and for secrets to stew unspoken behind curtained windows. Miss Marple, however, never allowed the weather to dictate her schedule, After her customary bowl of porridge and a brisk airing of the parlor, she set off toward the churchyard again. Only this time, she had a purpose beyond quiet contemplation. She carried with her a folded piece of notepaper on which she had written 4 names: Templeton, Withers, Cardiff, and Rex, and one more name, Constance Marchwood, added only that morning. Constance Marchwood had once lived in Cardiff, as Miss Marple recalled from a women's league talk nearly 15 years ago. She had since retired to the adjoining village of Weathercombe and was said to keep mostly to herself now. But Miss Marple remembered her as a woman of fine memory and even finer instincts, rare qualities, and just the sort she now required. With umbrella in hand and galoshes firmly strapped, she arrived at Rosebank Cottage by mid-morning. The little house stood hidden by a wall of privet hedges, the brass plate on the gate gleaming dully in the mist. A short rap on the knocker brought the slow shuffle of slippers. "Jane Marple," said the woman who opened the door. "Well, heavens, I haven't seen you since that frightful cake competition in '37. Do come in." Constance was older now, but her eyes remained keen. She led Miss Marple into a drawing room furnished with age-worn chintz and thick velvet drapes. A fire crackled in the hearth and the scent of lemon polish lingered in the air. "I need to ask you a rather strange question," Miss Marple began after the necessary pleasantries. "Do you by chance recall a man named Frederick Withers from your time in Cardiff, around the 1920s or so?" Constance's eyes narrowed, and her fingers tightened on the handle of her teacup. "Withers," she echoed. "Now there's a name I haven't heard in years." "Yes, I do remember. Though he didn't go by Frederick then. Everyone called him Rex." Miss Marple's heart gave a small, silent thump. "Rex?" Constance nodded. "He was quite the clever fellow, a bit of a chancer too, worked in land sales, if I recall. Always looking for the next big scheme. He and a few others, one of them was named Templeton, I think, had some partnership or other. It ended rather badly." "What sort of badly?" "There was a scandal," Constance said, frowning. "A land development scheme in the North Docks. Legal trouble. One of the junior partners took the blame. I think it was Templeton. Afterward, the whole group vanished. Rex Withers disappeared overnight." "Do you remember anyone threatening him?" Miss Marple asked. "Not openly," Constance said. "But there was talk. Letters to the paper. Accusations about forged deeds. I didn't follow all the details. But I always thought Withers was the one who got away clean." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And now he's running an inn in Lower Melford under the name Felix." "Well," said Constance, lifting an eyebrow, "if that doesn't reek of reinvention, I don't know what does." They spoke for a few moments more, but Miss Marple already had what she needed. By the time she left Rosebank Cottage, the drizzle had stopped, and the clouds were beginning to thin into strips of pewter. Back in Lower Melford, Daphne Withers stood in the sitting room of the inn, staring at her reflection in the glass of a darkened window. The Swan's Head felt colder now, emptied of its charm, filled instead with hushed voices and accusing glances. She had barely spoken to her father since the morning before. He had become withdrawn, more than usual, and spent most of his time locked in the study. Once or twice she had heard the creak of floorboards above her at odd hours, footsteps pacing. But he did not seek her out. Part of her was angry. The other part was afraid. When the knock came at the front door, she almost didn't answer. But habit took over. "Miss Marple," she said, surprised. "I wonder if you'd take a short walk with me," Miss Marple said kindly. "There's something I believe you ought to hear." They walked side by side toward the edge of the village, where the hedgerows turned wild and the path narrowed into a foot trail. The air was clean now, rinsed by the rain, and the world had the quiet hush of recovery. "Your father," Miss Marple began gently, "once went by the name Rex Withers. He lived in Cardiff and was involved in a business enterprise with a man named Templeton, your Mr. Blaine." Daphne turned pale. I had no idea." "I believe you. It was long before your time. But it matters now because Templeton, when he arrived, was not simply hiding. He was confronting an old wound, perhaps even blackmailing." Daphne stopped walking. Do you think my father killed him? Miss Marple looked at her with quiet compassion. I do not know, but I do know this. Templeton did not climb into that room. He climbed out. He had spoken to someone already, and that someone had good reason to silence him afterward. They resumed walking. Miss Marple's voice was steady, her words carefully measured. I also believe someone else, someone Templeton never expected, was involved in keeping his past quiet, and that person may have panicked when the truth threatened to surface. Daphne's brow furrowed. You mean someone else in the village? Miss Marple gave her a sidelong glance. Someone with something to lose. That evening, as the village settled into its twilight rituals, a new discovery rippled through the Swan's head. Inspector Galloway, now staying in a small room above the post office, had returned to inspect the study. With Felix momentarily away on an errand in Tightest, Galloway used the opportunity to examine the locked cabinet behind the desk. The key, rather conveniently, had been left in the lock. Inside was a stack of old records and invoices. But behind them, tucked at the back, was a faded envelope addressed to Rex Withers in a bold, slanting hand. The return address? L. Templeton, Cardiff. Galloway sat down slowly and opened the letter. It was brief. Rex. You owe me more than silence. You owe me justice. I took the fall for both of us. I have kept your secret for 20 years, but I won't do it forever. You'll hear from me soon. LT. The inspector folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and stared out the window. Miss Marple had been right. But if this letter had been kept, hidden, not destroyed, it meant something else. Felix Withers had expected Templeton's arrival and had chosen to hide it. Now the question was, had he planned to stop him all along, or was someone else faster to act? The web was tightening, and Galloway had a feeling that the next lie would unravel the whole affair. Chapter 8. A visit in the dark. The village clock had just chimed 10 when Miss Marple set down her teacup and folded her hands. Outside, the night was cool and moonless, and the shadows in Lower Melford seemed longer than usual. She could feel it, the peculiar hush that settled over a place just before the truth stirred beneath the surface. There was a knock at her door. Unhurriedly, she crossed the small hallway and opened it. It was Felix Withers. He looked worn and pale, his coat unbuttoned, his eyes rimmed red with sleeplessness. I'm sorry to trouble you so late, he said. May I come in? Of course, Miss Marple replied calmly. I was expecting someone, though I didn't quite know who. She led him into the sitting room where the fire burned low. He sat stiffly on the edge of the settee, like a man awaiting judgment. I know you've been asking questions, he began. About Cardiff, about Templeton, about Rex. Miss Marple simply nodded. It is not my nature to pry, Mr. Withers, but when murder occurs in one's village, one feels a certain moral obligation to understand why. Felix gave a hollow laugh. Yes, why? That's always the question, isn't it? He paused, then looked directly at her. My name, my real name, is Frederick Rex Withers. I went by Rex back then, in Cardiff. I suspected as much, Miss Marple said gently. I was part of a group, he continued. Templeton, myself, and two others, Godfrey Hull and Everett Dane. We were ambitious, arrogant. We started a development firm. Land was cheap near the docks. We promised housing, investments, returns. And there were none, Miss Marple finished. Felix's eyes dropped. We sold parcels of land we didn't legally own, forged documents. It was Templeton who did the actual forgery, but we all benefited. And when the authorities began to close in, we panicked. You let him take the fall. Yes. Felix's voice was low now. He was the only one charged. We all lied, swore we'd known nothing, said he acted alone, and he didn't name us. I think he believed we'd reward his silence, but we didn't. We scattered. And you came here, said Miss Marple. I changed my name, bought the inn, married, raised Daphne, tried to be someone else. But the past, Miss Marple said softly, has an inconvenient habit of writing its own letters. Felix exhaled. Yes. He wrote me, a few months ago. Said he wanted to meet. Said he wanted to settle things face to face. I kept the letter, I don't know why. Guilt, maybe. He arrived on Friday, Miss Marple said. You spoke? I did. Late that night after everyone else was in bed. He wasn't angry, not at first. He said he wanted something simple. A signed confession. Not for court, he said, but so that the record wouldn't be lost when we were gone. Did you agree? I said I'd think on it. But I couldn't risk it. If it came out everything I built here, my reputation, Daphne's life, it would collapse. So you refused. Felix's jaw tightened. He said he'd give me until Sunday, which was the day he died. He nodded, silent. Did you kill him, Mr. Withers? The question hung in the air, not an accusation but a soft, persistent truth-seeking. No, Felix whispered. God help me, I thought about it. I even unlocked the study drawer where I keep the brandy decanter and the old pistol. But I couldn't. I told myself, perhaps if I stalled him, he'd give up. Leave. Miss Marple regarded him carefully. Do you know who did? Felix didn't answer, but his eyes gave him away. They were in the inn that night, she said gently. He nodded. They must have been. I locked the back door at 10. No one else had a key. Except Daphne. He flinched. She didn't do it, he said quickly. She couldn't have. Couldn't have, Miss Marple repeated quietly. Or wouldn't have. Felix said nothing. After a moment, Miss Marple stood and crossed to the window. Outside, the mist had returned, clinging to the low hedges and garden gate. The inn stood opposite, its windows dark save one. Faint light spilled from the room above the study. I do not think Daphne killed him, Miss Marple said finally. But I do think she may have known something. Or seen something. Perhaps even spoken to him that evening. I didn't want her involved, Felix murmured. She's innocent. She has nothing to do with my past. I am not so sure, Miss Marple replied. Children carry more of their parents' burdens than we care to admit. She turned back to him. Tell me, did she ever mention a name to you? A name like Everett Dane? Felix stiffened. Why? Because Everett Dane did not vanish. After Cardiff, he resurfaced in London under the name Eric Densley. There was a civil case filed 3 years ago, a corporate dispute. Templeton was named in it. Quietly, of course. Felix blinked. I didn't know that. I believe Templeton came here with more than just a confession in mind. I think he had a plan to expose all 3 of you, and someone else. Perhaps Mr. Dane discovered that. You think he followed Templeton? I think someone did, and I think someone else helped them once they arrived. Felix's face had gone pale again. But who? Miss Marple gave him a soft look. That, Mr. Withers, is something I must confirm, and I fear time is running out. He rose slowly. If you find out who did it, I will let you know, she said. But I do suggest you speak to your daughter, openly, before someone else does. Felix lingered a moment more, then nodded and let himself out, his steps heavy on the path. Miss Marple returned to her chair and reached for her knitting, though her hands were still. Her mind was alive with connections, threading through timelines, motivations, and suppressed truths. There was someone else involved. Of that she was now certain. Someone who had once walked the same shadowed road as Rex Withers and Lawrence, Templeton, and who had finally decided that the past could only stay buried if the witness was silenced. But who? She cast on another stitch. The answer, she knew, was in Lower Melford. She simply had to look where no one else had dared. Chapter 9. The Man from the Garage. The next morning brought with it a peculiar energy in Lower Melford. A tension just beneath the surface, as if the village itself sensed that the final act was approaching. Doors were opened with more care than usual, glances lingered longer, and greetings carried an unmistakable undertone of curiosity. Miss Marple, having completed her morning routine with typical precision, set off not toward the Swan's Head Inn, nor toward the vicarage or the records office, but to a modest brick building on the edge of the village, Baxter's Garage. It was a functional, greasy little place, home to 2 mechanics, a wireless that never quite worked, and a particular young man Miss Marple had been waiting to see again. Martin Gates, sweetheart of Ellen Ray, and one of the few people known to have been out and about on the night of Templeton's murder. Martin was crouched beside the rear tire of a green Austin 7 when Miss Marple arrived, sleeves rolled and forehead slick, with oil. He straightened as she approached, blinking as though trying to place her. "You're Miss Marple, aren't you?" he asked cautiously, wiping his hands on a rag. "I am. And you must be Mr. Gates. I do hope I'm not interrupting." Martin shrugged. "Job'll wait. What can I do for you?" Miss Marple gave him a gentle smile. "I was hoping you might help me understand something. You see, I've been thinking about your late-night walks to meet Ellen." Martin's brow furrowed. "She told you about that?" "She did." "Don't worry, I've told no one else. It's not the meeting I'm interested in. It's what you may have seen. Or heard." Martin hesitated. "Ellen said she saw someone climbing down." "She told me, but I didn't see that." Miss Marple nodded patiently. "But perhaps you saw someone after that, leaving the garden perhaps, or even walking along the lane." Martin looked uncertain. "I didn't think it mattered. But it might." He sighed. "It was dark, but yeah, I saw someone. Just for a second, near the lich gate by the church. Do you remember anything about them?" "Tallish, wearing a long coat, hat pulled low, walked quickly. Real purpose in the stride, you know, but I figured it was just one of the guests from the inn." "Did the figure carry anything?" Martin paused. "A briefcase, maybe? Something stiff and square. Hard to tell in the dark." Miss Marple's heart gave a quiet stir. "And did you happen to mention this to anyone?" Martin shook his head. "No. Why would I?" "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "Thank you. You've been very helpful." She turned to go, but Martin called. "After her, Miss Marple." "Yes?" "Do you think Ellen's in danger?" There was genuine worry in his voice. Miss Marple smiled gently. "No, Mr. Gates, but I think she's very lucky to have someone so observant watching out for her." Back at the Swan's Head, Inspector Galloway had resumed his steady excavation of the past. He now had a stack of letters, bank statements, and personal documents spread across Felix Withers's study table. The letter from Templeton was at the center of it all. He glanced up as Miss Marple entered without fanfare. "I hear you've taken a tour of the garage," he said dryly. "Information flows more easily when one walks softly," she replied, removing her gloves. "You may be interested to know a man was seen leaving the area near the inn the night of the murder. Tall, long coat, hat, carrying something briefcase-like." Galloway frowned. "That matches what Templeton was carrying when he arrived." "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "Only he was found without it." Galloway cursed softly. "Then someone took it." Miss Marple nodded. "Which suggests the motive was not simply silence, it was possession. Templeton may have brought with him the very thing that could destroy his former partners. Proof. Precisely. Documents, signatures, correspondence. Things that linked the old frauds to more recent ones. Templeton, I believe, came to extract a confession, but he also came with a threat." Galloway leaned back. "So the question becomes, who else, aside from Withers, knew Templeton was here?" "Everett Dane," Miss Marple said quietly. "He has used the name Eric Densley in London. He was involved in a case with Templeton 3 years ago, quietly settled, and I believe he followed Templeton here." Galloway straightened. "You're sure?" "I am confident. I did some research. Densley's business records show a sudden trip to Devonshire the same weekend Templeton arrived. Paid in cash, no hotel bookings. Likely he stayed hidden, waiting. Waiting to see if Templeton succeeded, Galloway asked, or waiting for the right moment to strike. Either way, I believe it was he whom Martin Gates saw near the church gate. I believe he took the briefcase after Templeton was murdered." Galloway's mind was already racing. "If we find that briefcase, we'll find the truth," Miss Marple finished. That afternoon, under Galloway's quiet orders, a search was made of the surrounding woods near Lower Melford. Nothing was found on the first sweep. But the second sweep, conducted by the village constable and a local gamekeeper, uncovered something curious in a shallow hole beneath the roots of a beech tree, a tin-lined attaché case wrapped in waxed canvas and sealed with twine. It contained several letters bearing Templeton's and Withers's old signatures, a forged land title, dated 1926, 3 business contracts, each signed E. Dane and R. Withers. A handwritten document in D.I.2, Templeton's firm script, statement of events regarding the North Dock scheme Cardiff. The truth, it seemed, had been buried quite literally. Galloway stood over the opened case in the station office that evening, reading page after page as the fire cracked behind him. Miss Marple sat nearby, her knitting needles clicking softly. He followed him, Galloway said quietly. He waited until Templeton made his move, and when Withers didn't act, he did. Miss Marple gave a small nod. Everett Dane always had the temperament for quiet efficiency. Galloway folded the top letter and looked up. Now we just need to find him. Miss Marple looked thoughtful. Oh, I believe we already have. Galloway blinked. What? She reached into her handbag and handed him a photograph. Taken at the Swan's Head 2 days before the murder. Look closely at the group by the trellis. Galloway squinted, then stiffened. There, standing half obscured, behind a flowering vine, in a nondescript coat and wide-brimmed hat, was a man with a faintly familiar profile. That's him, Galloway murmured. That's Dane. Under the name Mr. Ellis. He checked out the morning after the murder, said he'd been visiting his cousin in Tightest. No one questioned it, but he had no cousin. Galloway's mouth tightened into a grim line. We'll find him, Miss Marple nodded. Yes, and when you do, he will have much to answer for. But even as she said it, she knew there was still one piece left, one final thread to pull. Because even now, she was not entirely certain that Dane had acted alone. Chapter 10. The Confession. Beneath the ivy, the final days of the affair unfolded, as quietly as the village had hoped, but not before the truth, long buried and carefully veiled, was laid bare in the most Miss Marple of fashions, politely, devastatingly, and without a raised voice. Detective Inspector Galloway wasted no time. The moment the photograph from the Swan's Head was confirmed by his contacts in London, an alert was issued for Everett Dane, alias Eric Densley, last seen boarding a morning train from Totnes to Paddington under a false name. He was apprehended, within 36 hours in a boarding house in South Kensington, carrying a false passport and a wallet stuffed with notes, letters, and torn contracts. Though he initially denied involvement, the briefcase found near Lower Melford and Templeton's handwritten statement proved otherwise, but when confronted with the photograph, Dane faltered. And when Galloway produced Templeton's letter to Rex alongside records of Dane's financial transactions from the week prior, matching the withdrawal amounts in Devon, his silence was damning. Yes, he finally said in a flat voice. I killed him. He had planned to expose us all. I followed him, watched him check in, waited for the girl to leave, and I climbed through the window and strangled him. What about the briefcase? Galloway asked. I took it, hid it, planned to retrieve it later when the fuss died down. But your old woman, she ruined that. That old woman, of course, was Miss Marple. But what Dane didn't know, what no one knew until the following Sunday, was that he had not acted alone. Miss Marple waited until the village had begun to settle again, until the gossip turned to whether the harvest fete would go ahead despite all the trouble, and until the Swan's Head Inn had reopened under a cautious shadow. She paid a final visit to the Withers household on a sunny afternoon, bringing with her a small basket of plum preserves and her usual calm. Felix Withers received her in the parlor. His eyes were weary but clearer now, as if a burden had been lifted. I hear they've charged Dane, he said quietly. Yes, Miss Marple replied. It was he who committed the murder, and he has admitted as much. Felix nodded, his gaze falling to the edge of the carpet. Then it's done. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. Not entirely. He looked up sharply. There's one matter left. One final piece, she said. You see, Dane may have murdered Templeton, but he did not find him. Not alone. Felix's breath caught. He didn't know which room Templeton had been given. Miss Marple went on. The inn was empty, yes, but there are 4 rooms on the upper floor. Only someone familiar with the Swan's Head could have pointed Dane to room 6. She let the silence stretch. And I believe that person was your daughter. Felix stood, abruptly. No, she would never. She didn't kill him, Miss Marple said gently. But I believe Daphne spoke to Templeton. Perhaps he told her more than he meant to. Perhaps she went to you with it, and you tried to stall, to protect her. But Daphne, in her fear, in her desperation to preserve the life you'd built together, told someone else. Felix's expression twisted. You don't understand. I do, Miss Marple said. I understand very well. A daughter, faced with the ruin of her father's name. A young woman whose only sin was misplaced trust. She didn't know what Dane was capable of. But she pointed him to the room. Felix slumped into the chair, as if the truth had knocked the strength from his legs. I thought I could bury it. Forever, he murmured. But Templeton wouldn't let it lie. And Daphne, she only wanted to protect me. She didn't even know who Dane really was. Miss Marple sat down opposite him. You must tell Galloway, she said. Tell him. Daphne didn't know, that she thought she was merely passing a message. If you don't, the truth may find her another way. Felix covered his face with his hands. How did you know? Miss Marple smiled sadly. Because I watched her the morning after. She avoided the rose bed. She flinched when Crail mentioned the time of death. And she never asked why Templeton had been killed, only whether her father was involved. It is the kind of question only someone with guilt might ask. She stood and placed a hand gently on his shoulder. There are many ways to atone, Mr. Withers. This is one of them. In the weeks that followed, the story of the Swan's Head Inn slowly became part of Lower Melford's lore. Everett Dane stood trial and was sentenced to life imprisonment. His crime, legally solitary, had moral accomplices, yet the law, as Miss Marple knew well, could only reach so far. Felix Withers gave a private statement to the authorities, explaining the full extent of his past dealings and his daughter's unknowing role in Dane's approach. Charges were not pursued, perhaps because Templeton himself had sought justice, not vengeance, or perhaps because the war had left the courts with heavier burdens, so. For Daphne, she left Lower Melford a month later. Miss Marple received a letter, neatly written, gracious, and full of apologies. Daphne had taken a position as a governess in Bath. She hoped to begin anew. Miss Marple folded the letter and placed it with the others she kept in her cedarwood box labeled Human Nature. A small, sad smile touched her lips. On the first truly warm day of May, she sat once again in her garden, knitting needles in hand, as bees wandered lazily between the lavender and delphinium. The Swan's Head Inn was quieter now, its guests more reserved. The new housekeeper, a stout woman named Mrs. Pegg, had already made changes to the menu and turned the upstairs study into a reading room. All seemed peaceful. But Miss Marple knew better. Peace was never the absence of wrongdoing. It was merely the quiet between truths. And in villages like Lower Melford, those truths always came round again, eventually.